Welcome folks. Today we turn our linguistic nerdery efforts over to Altaic, the poster child of the Long Ranger community and a hypothesis that causes a lot, and I mean a lot, of division and discussion amongst us here on YouTube and in the wider linguistic community. It's very much the Marmite of proposed language families. And honestly, I've put off making this video for some time because, well, there's already a really good effort out there covering the topic. Native Lang did a video on Altaic, and it is a far more beautiful creation than I could ever come up with, covering a lot of ground I would naturally tread. But nevertheless, I'm going to give it a go today, and I'll try to add my personal touch and bring you some extra value, even if you have seen that video before. But herein lies another problem. I'm not entirely sure what my take is concerning Altaic. For me, I somehow find myself both liking and disliking Altaic at the same time. Sometimes I admire it for its audacity and scope, yet other times I get annoyed because things veer uncomfortably close on occasion to pseudo-linguistics. But whatever my take is, I do know that putting a video together is always the best way for me to become more intimate and familiar with the subject. So who knows, maybe I'll have a more definite opinion to give you at the end of today's video and the next, because, well folks, this is going to be a two-parter for sure. So with that all said and done, let's get stuck into things. Well, like all language family proposals, in the literature it comes in a few different flavours and variants. The two most common are macro and micro-Altaic. And for part one of this two-part video series, we'll be focusing mainly on the micro variant, although of course there will be some overlap. The main difference between the two is which languages are traditionally included in the mix. For Altaic proper, so micro-Altaic or sometimes core Altaic, it consists of Turkic, Mongolic and Tungusic. The term Altaic was first used in 1845 by the Finnish linguist Mattias Aleksanteri Kastren. Here Altaic referred to a belt of languages including Finno-Ugric, Samoyedic, Turkic, Mongolic and Tungusic, and possibly some other minor language groups. Although ideas proposing some form of unity between them goes back even earlier. Kastren's original idea was that the Altaic languages, which according to him also included the Uralic languages, had expanded from the Altai region in southern Siberia and western Mongolia. The geographic origin is no longer widely accepted, even among Altaicists, but nonetheless, this was the genesis of the idea. And such a broad transcontinental grouping of languages later went on to serve as a kind of building block for even broader, more geographically dispersed proposals such as Nostratic and Eurasiatic. The work of Ramstedt in the early to mid 20th century, followed by Popper in the 1950s and 60s, laid the foundations for what became the standard formulation of the Altaic hypothesis. By then, Uralic had been mercilessly stripped from the proposal, and the main point of discussion lay around Korean and the nature of its relationship to Altaic. In the early 1970s, Japanese was even brought into the mix, giving us what eventually became known as macro-Altaic. But almost as soon as the hypothesis was put forward, it attracted a very energetic swarm of very vocal detractors, including some names we've encountered before on this channel. And ever since, we've seen something of a street fight between the two camps, the pro-Altaicists on one side and the anti-Altaicists on the other. And it has to be said that in recent years, the momentum has firmly been with the anti-Altaic camp. However, this division really only applies to those who treat Altaic as a language relationship in the traditional sense, that is, a genetic one, and those, on the other hand, who see little to no evidence for such a connection. A more moderate view is that Altaic represents a Sprachbund, or a linguistic complex. In other words, a set of features shared areally across these languages. This position is far less controversial, and in a sense it forms a continuum. Most researchers are at least somewhat Altaic in that they recognise a degree of areal influence. The real question in the field is how much influence is there, and in which linguistic domains it operates. But crucially, it's important to remember that these are completely different kinds of claims, a genetic one versus an areal zone, and they live or die on completely different kinds of evidence. So someone can be very much anti-Altaic in the sense that they see no real evidence for a genetic relationship, but still be pro-Altaic in the sense that they view it as an areal zone. And this position probably includes the bulk of researchers these days. So you might be asking yourself, what evidence do we have for Altaic? Well, one of the earliest observations was the following between Turkic and Mongolic. The Turkic correspondence depends on which primary branch of Turkic you are consulting. We also have the proto-forms, including Proto-Altaic, and on the right hand side here we can see the Tungusic reflex. Another well-known correspondence can be seen in the following example. Again, the Altaic reconstructed form is given. On screen now, I'll present some vocabulary correspondences found in the 1965 work An Introduction to Altaic Linguistics. These serve as examples of so-called basic words shared between the three Altaic language families in question. The forms given are the same as they appear in the book. Now, if you're interested in the lexicon or the proposed lexicon of Altaic, then as far as controversial language family propositions go, there's a wealth of material out there. But one work in particular really stands out, and I'm sure many viewers of this channel will have heard of it already. The 3-volume Etymological Dictionary of the Altaic Languages. It is a beast of a publication with over 2,800 proposed lexical matches across the Altaic languages. Japanese and Korean forms are included as well, but the bulk of the material is drawn from the micro-Altaic languages. You can tell that the book is a real labour of love from the authors, and I will say, even if you're not an Altaicist, and this is perhaps my personal guilty secret, I find it somewhat useful as a general reference work for the lexicon of the 3 micro-Altaic languages. I consult it more often than I'm probably happy to admit. And yeah, for sure, I will definitely check another source to confirm anything, more significant than a passing curiosity. But very often this is the first place I go when, for example, I want to check if an Evenki term is similar to the Manchu or something like that. But we will come back to this publication later. For those who are interested, I'll now put some linguistic nerd stuff on screen, comparing the 3 proto-languages of micro-Altaic. This should give you a nice flavour of how these languages are often seen as being typologically similar. The data for these proto-languages has, as far as possible, been sourced from non-Altaicist work, favouring therefore reconstructions based on each language family's internal evidence. The Proto-Turkic and Proto-Tungusic data is basically from my 2 videos on the proto-languages, and the Mongolic is from the Mongolic Languages by Jan Hunen, 2003. A few points to note. Vowel harmony in Tungusic shows a high degree of internal variation, which has led some scholars to speculate that it may have been absent at the Proto-Tungusic level, and was later incorporated through areal influence. Regarding case systems, the numbers given here represent the number of cases currently reconstructed at the proto level. Actual daughter languages show considerable variation. Some Tungusic varieties, for example, have up to 15 cases. The nominative case is always unmarked in Altaic. Now, the pronouns have probably caught most people's attention. Much has been written about these correspondences in the past. Some see the similarities as evidence of shared genetic heritage, as pronouns are often assumed to be resistant to borrowing. Others point out that there is evidence for languages borrowing pronoun systems globally, and there are even some Eurasian examples of such things. Jan Hunnen, in his article Personal Pronouns in Core Altaic, argues that the Altaic systems are in fact too similar to be of genetic origin and instead suggests a path of shared drift. Taken together, these shared structural features go hand in hand with the putative shared lexicon that we looked at a few moments ago, and together they have often been seen as the smoking gun for viewing Altaic as a genetic language family. But let's take it one step further, and why don't we put ourselves in the shoes of a traditional Altaicist and try to imagine how they see the debate. To do that, I've taken a random series of vocabulary items from the Etymological Dictionary of the Altaic languages, and we can see what kind of evidence we've got. And probably the first thing an Altaicist would point out is just look at these correspondences, especially in the initial and medial consonants. They appear remarkably consistent, don't they? And some of these terms, like night and to burn, well, they represent basic vocabulary, which is significant to some researchers, and we have to remember that this is just a small selection. Across Altaic studies as a whole, there are thousands of such comparisons of comparable quality. Then they might say, look at this spatial correspondence at the top between Tungusic and Mongolic. An Altaicist might also note that in some reconstructions of Tungusic, like Jan Hunnen's, it's been suggested that certain case markers, like the dative, may have developed from much earlier spatial markers through grammaticalization. This is particularly interesting because if we take a closer look at case markers, well, what do you know? We even have correspondences between the Proto-Tungusic and Proto-Mongolic dative and the Turkic locative. So from an Altaicist perspective, we don't just have lexical evidence, we also appear to have inflectional correspondences, which are often assumed to be much more resistant to borrowing. Combine that with the structural similarities we looked at earlier, things like the pronominal systems, and you can see why traditional Altaicists have doggedly argued that this is a genuine genetic language family. Now, of course, with any long-range proposal, you get a kind of linguistic Newton's third law. For every claim, there's an equal and opposite reaction. And Altaic has provoked a reaction just as strong as the support behind it. We can see a good example of this when we return to the Etymological Dictionary of the Altaic languages. Because while it did attract some positive responses, many reviewers praised the ambition of the authors, it was also ultimately seen as being an over-ambitious project. The authors were basically trying to do too much in one go. And as I said earlier, I find myself using the dictionary more often than I'd like to admit, and that is true, but I use it in a very specific way, and I think that's quite revealing in and of itself. Firstly, I never use it for anything connected to Korean or Japanese. Not that I work on those languages much, but from time to time I do need to check something. And I rarely use it to inform comparisons between Tungusic, Mongolic and Turkic. Instead, I just use it as a reference within each individual language family, to see whether a term is found across one branch or multiple, for example. Now, this kind of view was also expressed by reviewers such as Norman, who in a 2009 article, A New Look at Altaic, argued that the inclusion of Korean and Japanese actually weakened the work, and I have to completely agree there. In Native Lang's video on Altaic, he covers Vovin's response to the dictionary quite well, so do check that out, but I'll summarise Vovin's position here. Frankly, he wasn't very impressed at all. In fact, it's well worth reading Vovin's critiques of Altaic more generally because you'll find some magnificently worded burns in there. For example, regarding the Etymological Dictionary, he described it as an exemplary piece of anti-Altaic work, essentially suggesting that if this hefty volume is the best some of the leading Altaicists could come up with, then clearly the theory has very little to stand on. Vovin earlier in his career was actually more open to Altaic, but later on he progressively became one of its most vocal critics. He was clearly frustrated by what he saw as shoddy linguistic workmanship gaining such attention. Today then we're going to be looking at some of the details of Vovin's critique of the Etymological Dictionary of the Altaic languages, because many of his arguments extend beyond the dictionary itself and apply to the Altaic hypothesis more broadly. One of the central issues he highlights is what is often seen as the perennial silver bullet problem for Altaic, namely loanwords. Vovin argues that the issue is not handled convincingly in the volume, and that the extent of contact between the so-called macro-Altaic language families is significantly downplayed. To be fair to the authors, the first chapter is dedicated to addressing some of these concerns. However, much of the argument relies on accepting their conclusions without always being shown the full reasoning behind them. What doesn't help is that the references are sometimes inaccurate or a little imprecise, making independent verification unnecessarily time-consuming. Vovin also argues that the phonetic correspondences proposed in support of Altaic are often irregular, lack predictive value, and are based on a limited number of examples, which therefore significantly weakens their evidential value. He further points out that meanings assigned to many of these terms, particularly those presented for the first time in these volumes, have been stretched, broadened, or massaged to such an extent that it begins to test what the reader is expected to accept as evidence. This strikes me as somewhat fair criticism because in some cases when I read the work I get the impression that examples are included only because they fit an expected structural correspondence, even when the semantics are vague or only loosely aligned. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, Vovin argues that external language data is too often used to determine features that should first be established through internal reconstruction. In other words, if we're trying to determine a feature within Tungusic, we should rely on Tungusic data first and foremost. Only once that internal analysis has been sufficiently carried out should comparisons with Mongolic or Turkic be introduced. And even then, the internal evidence must remain primary. We can see an example of this when we take the proposed Proto-Mongolic term glossed as to be shy, to do a favour. We can compare this with the Proto-Turkic meaning peace and the Proto-Tungusic meaning to ease or peaceful. The problem is that that's not what the Mongolic term actually means. It refers specifically to behaving like a daughter-in-law. This is what the reference material says, and this is even noted at the bottom of the entry itself, but it's dismissed as a folk etymology because of the external evidence. However, that interpretation is questionable. The root here is in fact productive in Mongolic, forming terms related to female family members through marriage. The internal data is very clear, and there's no reason to use external data to reinterpret the meaning. Well folks, that's going to be all for this part 1. I do hope you found something valuable in my coverage of Altaic, or rather micro-Altaic. Remember, there is a part 2 coming up where we'll be focusing more on macro-Altaic and evaluating the Transeurasian rebranding, can we say? Comment your thoughts below, like, subscribe, buy me a coffee, do all that good stuff. You've been fantastic as always, and keep your eyes peeled for that part 2. It should be dropping in a week or so. Goodbye for now.